What happened? When a black soldier tried to propose to a German prison of war woman, her reaction left him. June 7, 1945. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Private James Thornton stood at attention in the midday sun, his olive-drab uniform already soaked through with sweat, watching as the transport trucks rolled through the gates of the prisoner of war camp. The convoy carried 43 German prisoners captured during the final collapse of the Third Reich. Most were men, exhausted soldiers from shattered Wehrmacht units, but mixed among them were 7 women, civilian auxiliaries and support personnel swept up in the chaos of Germany's defeat. Thornton had been assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 7th Service Command, one of thousands of black soldiers tasked with guarding enemy prisoners on American soil while white combat units fought overseas. The irony wasn't lost on him. He wore the uniform of a nation that wouldn't let him eat at the same lunch counters as the men he served alongside. He guarded prisoners who were treated better than his own family back in Mississippi. The prisoners filed out of the trucks in silence. Their faces told stories of a war that had consumed everything. Hunger had hollowed their cheeks. Fear had carved lines around their eyes. They expected brutality. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for torture, starvation, execution. Instead, they were met with Geneva Convention protocols and American efficiency. Corporal Martha Foster, a white nurse from Ohio, moved among them with practiced compassion. She checked each prisoner for injuries, distributing water from a metal canteen that had been cooled in the camp's ice house. The prisoners drank like they'd never tasted clean water before. Many hadn't, not in months. Thornton watched as the processing began. Each prisoner was photographed, documented, and assigned a barracks number. The camp had been built in 90 days flat, one of over 500 such facilities scattered across 45 states. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, medical facilities that exceeded what most German civilians possessed. It was then that Thornton noticed her. She stood near the back of the group, a young woman perhaps 22 or 23 years old. Her blonde hair was cut short, practical for wartime. Her gray eyes stared at the ground, never meeting the gaze of any American soldier. She wore a threadbare gray dress that might have been blue once, before the war had washed all the color out of everything. Her name, according to the roster Sergeant Thomas Carter read aloud, was Helena Müller. Listed as a communications specialist from a Wehrmacht signals unit captured near Munich on May 3rd. 23 years old. No family listed as surviving. What struck Thornton wasn't her appearance. It was the weight she seemed to carry. Every other prisoner showed relief, however cautious, at finding themselves alive and relatively safe. Helena Müller looked like she was carrying the entire war on her shoulders. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Captain Richard Hayes, the camp commander, addressed the new arrivals in careful German. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would work, but not in war production. They would be fed the same rations as American soldiers. They would receive mail from home when possible. Medical care would be provided without discrimination. The prisoners exchanged glances of disbelief. This couldn't be real. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. Thornton caught Helena's eyes for just a moment as she was led toward the women's barracks. In that brief instant, he saw something that would haunt him for weeks. Not hatred, not fear, just a profound, crushing sadness that seemed to go deeper than any war could reach. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would change everything he thought he knew about enemies, about hatred, and about what it meant to see another human being. June 12, 1945, 5 days after Helena Müller's arrival at Camp Concordia. The evening temperature had dropped to a merciful 75 degrees after a day that had peaked at 98. Private James Thornton walked the perimeter of the women's compound, his M1 Garand rifle slung over his shoulder, more for regulation than necessity. No prisoner had attempted escape from Camp Concordia. Where would they go? The women's barracks housed 24 German prisoners of war. They worked 8 hours daily in the camp laundry, processing uniforms for the entire facility. Army regulations specified they received the same pay as American servicewomen doing equivalent work, 80 cents per day, deposited in camp accounts where they could purchase items from the post exchange. Thornton had watched Helena for 5 days now. He told himself it was just part of his duty, monitoring prisoner behavior for security concerns. But he knew better. Something about her sadness called to something in him. Maybe it was recognition. He'd carried his own weight for 26 years, the accumulated burden of every slight, every indignity, every reminder that his country considered him less than whole. The camp followed strict protocols regarding prisoner interaction. Guards were prohibited from fraternizing. Conversations were to remain professional and purposeful, but the rules also mandated basic human decency. The Geneva Convention wasn't just words on paper. Captain Hayes enforced it like scripture. That evening, as Thornton completed his rounds, he found Helena sitting alone on the barracks steps. The other women had gone inside to escape the mosquitoes that rose from the nearby creek at dusk. She sat motionless, staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap. Thornton hesitated. Then he remembered Corporal Foster's words from his first day of guard duty. These people are prisoners, but they're still people. Don't forget that, and don't let them forget it either. He approached slowly, making sure his boots scuffed the gravel loud enough to announce his presence. Helena's head turned slightly, acknowledging him, but not meeting his eyes. "Evening, Miss Miller," Thornton said in careful, practiced German. The Army had provided basic language training to all guards. His accent was terrible, but the words were correct. "You should go inside. The mosquitoes will eat you alive out here." She didn't respond, didn't move. Thornton shifted his weight. He should walk away, complete his rounds, file his report. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she held herself, like a person waiting for punishment that never came. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother, sitting on their porch in Biloxi after his father died, carrying grief too heavy to share. "Wait here," he said, then immediately felt foolish. Where would she go? He walked to the guard station and returned 5 minutes later with 2 tin cups of coffee. The camp kitchen kept a pot going 24 hours a day. Real coffee, too, not the acorn substitute German civilians had been drinking since 1942. He offered her one of the cups. Helena stared at it like it might explode. "It's just coffee," Thornton said softly. "Nothing special." "Well, maybe it is special. It's hot, it's real, and you look like you could use something warm." She took the cup slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the metal. Steam rose in the evening air. She brought it to her lips, tasted it, and something in her expression cracked, just for a moment. Just enough. "Why?" she asked in heavily accented English, her first words to him. "Why what? Why kindness?" She looked up at him finally, her gray eyes searching his face. "We are enemies. I am German. You are American. This is not how it should be." Thornton smiled sadly. "Ma'am, I've spent my whole life being told how things should be. Who should sit where? Who should drink from which fountain? Who deserves dignity and who doesn't? I'm tired of how things should be." He gestured at the cup in her hands. "That's just coffee, from one person to another. No sides, no flags, just something warm on a cool evening." Helena held the cup with both hands now, like it might slip away. She didn't thank him. But she didn't throw it away either. And when Thornton continued his rounds, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like he'd done something that mattered. June 19th, 1945. The laundry detail. Helena Miller had been at Camp Concordia for 12 days, and her hands told the story. The prison camp laundry processed 3,000 uniforms weekly. Hot water, harsh soap, industrial wringer machines that could crush fingers if you weren't careful. The work was hard, monotonous, and absolutely nothing compared to what Helena had expected from American captivity. Private James Thornton had been assigned to supervise the laundry rotation that morning. Captain Hayes rotated guard assignments weekly to prevent what he called familiarization problems. But this week, Thornton found himself watching over the women's work detail for 6 hours daily. He tried to tell himself it was just duty, but he'd thought about Helena Miller every day since the coffee. The way she'd held that cup like it was something precious. The question she'd asked. Why kindness? The laundry building was a converted warehouse, concrete floor and corrugated metal roof that turned the interior into an oven by mid-morning. Industrial fans pushed hot air around without cooling anything. The women worked in shifts, 2 hours on the washing machines, 2 hours on the drying and folding tables, 2 hours on the mending station where damaged uniforms were repaired. Helena worked the mending station that morning. She had skilled hands, quick with needle and thread. Thornton watched her repair a torn sleeve, her stitches small and even. She worked with the focused intensity of someone trying to disappear into the task. At 10 o'clock, she stood to carry a basket of mended uniforms to the folding station. The basket was overloaded, at least 30 pounds of heavy cotton fabric. She lifted it wrong, twisting as she rose, and something in her hand gave way. The basket dropped. Helena gasped, cradling her right hand against her chest. Thornton was moving before he realized it. Let me see. Helena pulled her hand away instinctively. It is nothing. I can work. Let me see, he repeated, gentler this time. That's not a request, Miss Miller. That's me following regulations. Any injury gets checked by medical. Captain Hayes's orders. She extended her hand slowly. The palm was split open, a diagonal cut from the base of her thumb across to her pinky finger. Blood welled up, dark and steady. A sharp edge on the basket's handle had done it. Come on, Thornton said, already heading toward the door. Medical station, now. The camp medical station occupied a small building near the administration offices. Corporal Martha Foster looked up from her paperwork as Thornton and Helena entered. What happened? Foster asked, already reaching for her medical kit. Cut on the hand, laundry basket. Foster examined the wound with practiced efficiency. Needs stitches, 3, maybe 4. Sit down, honey. She gestured Helena toward a metal chair. As Foster prepared her instruments, Thornton stood by the door, technically on duty but really just unable to leave. He watched Foster clean the wound, watched Helena's jaw clench against the pain, watched her refuse to cry out even when the iodine burned. You're tough, Foster said as she threaded a curved needle. But you don't have to be, you know? It's okay to say when something hurts. In my country, Helena said quietly, showing pain is weakness. Weakness is punished. Foster paused, needle in hand. Well, you're not in your country anymore. Here, being hurt is just being human. Nothing wrong with that. The stitching took 10 minutes. Helena sat perfectly still, her free hand gripping the edge of the chair hard enough to turn her knuckles white. Thornton found himself wanting to offer her something to hold on to, some comfort, but regulations and propriety kept him across the room. When Foster finished, she wrapped the hand in clean gauze and secured it with medical tape. No laundry work for a week. I'll write you a duty exemption. You'll work in the camp library instead, shelving books. Light duty only. After Helena left with her paperwork, Foster looked at Thornton with knowing eyes. "You brought her in fast. Most guards would have just sent word for me to come to the laundry." "Regulations say—" "I know what the regulations say, Private. I also know what I see." Foster's voice wasn't unkind. "Just be careful. There are rules for good reasons. She's a prisoner. You're a guard. Some lines shouldn't be crossed." Thornton nodded, but as he walked back to the laundry building, he realized the truth. Some lines were already crossed. He just hadn't admitted it yet. He'd stopped seeing Helena as a prisoner weeks ago. Maybe he'd never really seen her that way at all. June 26th, 1945. The camp library occupied 2 rooms in the recreation building, stocked with 5,000 books donated by churches, civic organizations, and the American Red Cross. Everything from dime novels to philosophy texts. German prisoners could request books in their native language. The Army provided dictionaries for those learning English. Private James Thornton had volunteered for library duty. It wasn't a popular assignment among the guards. Boring, they said. Nothing happening. Just prisoners reading quietly for hours. But Thornton found the peace appealing after months of watching perimeter fences and conducting bag searches. The fact that Helena Mueller had been assigned to library duty for her recovery period was, he told himself, purely coincidental. She arrived at 8 in the morning, her right hand still wrapped in Foster's gauze, carrying a list of shelving tasks from Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the civilian librarian who managed the collection. Chen was a Chinese-American woman from San Francisco, one of the few civilians who worked inside the camp. She treated prisoners and guards with identical courtesy. "Good morning, Miss Miller," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "Your job is simple. Return books to their correct shelves. Use this cart. If you can't reach a high shelf, ask Private Thornton for help. If your hand hurts, stop immediately. Understood?" Helena nodded. Mrs. Chen handed her the cart and returned to her desk. For the first hour, Thornton and Helena worked in silence. He sat near the entrance, technically monitoring the room, actually reading a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath that someone had left behind. Helena pushed her cart between shelves, returning books with her left hand, her movements slow and careful. Around 9:30, she reached a shelf that required standing on a step stool. She tried to balance the book in her bandaged right hand while climbing, but the physics wouldn't cooperate. The book slipped. Thornton caught it before it hit the floor. "Here," he said, taking the book. "Tell me where it goes. I'll put it up." Helena stared at him for a long moment. "Why do you help me?" "Because you need help, and I'm here." "But I am prisoner. You are guard. This is not your job." Thornton smiled slightly. "My job is to make sure nobody escapes and nobody gets hurt. Helping you put away books seems like it fits under nobody gets hurt." He placed the book on the shelf she indicated, then turned to face her. "Can I ask you something?" Helena tensed but nodded. "That first night, when I gave you coffee, you asked why I was kind. I've been wondering why that question surprised you so much." Helena's expression closed off. For a moment, Thornton thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "All my life, I was taught that Americans are enemy, that Negroes are inferior, that kindness is weakness that strong people do not show." She looked down at her bandaged hand. "I was taught that only Germans deserve dignity, that everyone else exists to serve the Reich or be destroyed." She met his eyes, finally, and he saw shame there, raw and painful. "Then I am captured. I expect torture, death. Instead, I receive food, medical care, books." She gestured at the library around them. "I receive kindness from a man I was taught to hate twice over, because he is American, because he is black. And I do not understand it." Thornton was quiet for a moment, processing her honesty. "I was taught some things too," he said finally. "I was taught that white people would always hate me, that I should keep my head down and accept my place, that fighting back meant dying." He looked at his hands, remembering. "My father died when I was 12. He talked back to a white man in Biloxi. They called it an accident, but everybody knew, and I learned that lesson. Stay quiet. Stay small. Stay alive." "But then the war came," Thornton continued, "and the army needed bodies. Didn't matter what color they were, as long as they could hold a rifle. So here I am, wearing the uniform of a country that doesn't think I'm good enough to vote in most states, guarding prisoners from a country that murdered millions of people for being the wrong religion or the wrong race." He shook his head. "I spent a lot of time being angry, at white Americans, at Germans, at everybody. But somewhere along the way, I realized something. Hate is easy. Hate takes no courage. What takes courage is seeing somebody who's supposed to be your enemy and choosing to see a person instead." Helena's eyes were wet now. "I do not deserve this kindness." "Maybe not," Thornton said gently. "But neither do I. Neither does anybody, really. That's what makes it kindness instead of payment." They stood there in the quiet library, two people from opposite sides of the world, carrying wounds that went deeper than any hand injury could reach. And slowly, carefully, they began to set those burdens down. July 4th, 1945. Independence Day. The 4th of July celebration at Camp Concordia was mandatory for prisoners, part of what Captain Hayes called cultural education. The camp's recreation yard had been decorated with American flags and patriotic bunting. A small stage held a Navy band borrowed from the nearby Concordia Army Airfield. The menu featured hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, watermelon, and ice cream. Helena Miller stood at the edge of the crowd, her bandaged hand now reduced to just a light wrapping around her palm. The stitches had come out 2 days ago. Thin pink scars the only remaining evidence. She watched American soldiers and German prisoners mingle awkwardly, separated by language and history, but united by the simple fact of the food and music. Private James Thornton found her there, as he somehow always did these days. They'd fallen into a pattern over the past 2 weeks. He would volunteer for library duty. She would arrive to shelve books. They would talk, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty, about their families, their lives before the war, their fears about after. "You should eat something," Thornton said, appearing beside her with 2 paper plates. "The hot dogs aren't bad. I mean, they're army food, so they're not great, but they're not bad." Helena took the plate. "This is propaganda, yes? Show prisoners that America has food, has music, has freedom." "Probably," Thornton admitted. "But the hot dogs are still real, and propaganda or not, you should eat. You're too thin." They moved away from the crowd, finding a spot near the fence where they could talk without being overheard. The band was playing Stars and Stripes Forever, loud enough to cover their conversation. "I received a letter from German Red Cross," Helena said suddenly. "First mail since capture." "Good news?" "My mother is alive, in Munich, working in hospital." Helena's voice was carefully neutral, the way people spoke when feelings were too big to let out safely. "My father is dead, killed in bombing raid on Dresden in February. My brother died in Stalingrad in 1943. "I'm sorry," Thornton said, and meant it. "You lost family?" Helena asked. "My mother's still alive, far as I know. Haven't heard from her in 6 months, but mail is slow." He paused. "My father's been gone for 14 years, and I had a sister, Claire. She died in 1941. Pneumonia, no money for doctor." They sat in silence, 2 people mourning losses that war had caused or revealed. Around them, the celebration continued, a strange mixture of victor and vanquished pretending things were simpler than they were. Can I tell you something? Helena asked after a while. Something I have not told anyone? Of course. I am glad Germany lost. The words came out in a rush, like confession. I know this makes me traitor. I know I should feel loyalty, but I am glad, because maybe now it stops. The killing, the hate, the lies we told ourselves to justify everything. She looked at Thornton, her gray eyes intense. You asked me once why kindness surprised me. It is because I forgot that humans could be kind. In Germany, under the Nazis, kindness became crime. Helping wrong person meant death. Showing mercy was weakness. We were taught to be hard, to be cruel, to think that strength meant crushing others. But you're not like that, Thornton said. I can see it. You're not hard. I tried to be. Helena's voice broke slightly. I tried so hard to be what they wanted, to believe what they said, to hate who they told me to hate. But I could not. And I thought this made me broken, made me weak. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears. Then I come here, to prison, and prisoner shows me more humanity than my own country ever did. Guard treats me with more dignity than my own government, and I realized that I was not broken. They were. Thornton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently squeezed her uninjured hand. You're not broken, Helena. You're human, that's all. Just beautifully, messily complicated human. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed. So did he. Something shifted between them. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. James, she said, testing his name. He told her during one of their library conversations, but she'd never used it before. What happens when war is officially over? When prisoners go home? I don't know, he said honestly. I guess you go back to Germany. Try to rebuild. Try to start over. And you? Back to Mississippi, probably, unless I can figure out somewhere better to go. Somewhere where wearing this uniform actually means something. They sat there, hands barely touching, watching the celebration, both of them thinking about endings and beginnings and all the complicated space between. Around them, American soldiers and German prisoners were sharing watermelon, spitting seeds at targets, laughing at the simple ridiculousness of it. For just a moment, the war seemed very far away. But they both knew it wasn't. Not really. Some wars ended with treaties. Others just changed shape, became different battles in different arenas. And the war they were both fighting now, the one about who deserved dignity and who didn't, about who could love who and who would pay the price for crossing those lines. That war was just beginning. The sun set over Camp Concordia that Independence Day, painting the sky red and gold. And two people who should have been enemies sat side by side, holding on to a moment of peace before whatever came next. Chapter 6, July 18th, 1945. The camp library had become their sanctuary. Over 2 weeks, James Thornton and Helena Miller had fallen into an unspoken routine that existed in the margins of military regulation. He would arrive for his shift at 8 in the morning. She would appear 15 minutes later with her cart of books to shelve. They would work in comfortable silence, punctuated by conversations that grew longer and more honest each day. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, noticed but said nothing. She'd seen enough of the world to understand that kindness didn't follow the neat lines that regulations drew. As long as work got done and nobody got hurt, she believed in letting human connection happen where it could. That Wednesday morning, Helena arrived carrying something wrapped in brown paper. She set it on the cart carefully, then looked at James with an expression he couldn't quite read. Nervous, hopeful, afraid. I want to show you something, she said quietly. If you want to see. James set down the book he'd been cataloging. Of course. Helena unwrapped the paper slowly, revealing a photograph. The edges were worn soft from handling. The image showed a family of 4 standing in front of a stone house. A man in a suit, a woman in a Sunday dress, 2 children, a girl of perhaps 12 and a boy of maybe 10. "This is my family," Helena said. 1938, before everything changed. James studied the photograph. The girl was unmistakably Helena, younger but with the same serious eyes. "Your brother?" "Karl. He died at Stalingrad, 20 years old." Her voice was steady, but James heard the effort it took. "He wrote letters at first, talked about the cold, about being hungry, about missing home. Then the letters stopped coming." She pointed to the man in the photograph. "My father, Hermann Müller. He was a teacher before the war, mathematics. He believed in education, in reason, in logic." She paused. "He believed those things would protect him, that if he kept his head down and did his job, his family would be safe." "What happened to him?" James asked gently. "Dresden, February 13th. The bombing. He was visiting my aunt when the city burned." Helena's finger traced her father's face in the photograph. "My mother says he died instantly. I think she tells me this to make it easier. But fire does not kill instantly. Fire takes its time." James wanted to offer comfort, but didn't know what words could possibly help. His own father's death had taught him that some losses had no consolation. "And your mother?" he asked instead. "She works in a hospital in Munich now, 12 hours daily. She writes that the hospital has no medicine, no bandages, sometimes no water. But still they work because people still need help." Helena smiled sadly. She says this is her penance, for not speaking up when there was still time to speak. She wrapped the photograph carefully and placed it back on the cart. "I show you this because I want you to understand something. My family, they were not monsters. They were ordinary people who made ordinary choices, small compromises, little silences. They told themselves that keeping quiet was survival, that going along was wisdom." Helena looked at James directly now. "But ordinary choices led to extraordinary evil, and now my father is dead, my brother is dead, my country is destroyed, and I am here being shown kindness by the very people I was taught to hate." James understood what she was really saying. She was showing him the weight she carried, the guilt of survival, the shame of complicity, however passive. She was trusting him with her worst truth, that she'd been part of something monstrous, even if only by silence. "My father died because he talked back to a white man," James said after a moment. "He saw an injustice and spoke up, and they killed him for it. I spent years being angry at him, thinking he was stupid for not just keeping quiet." He met Helena's eyes. But he wasn't stupid. He was brave, and the real monsters were the people who made speaking truth a death sentence. They stood there in the quiet library, 2 people who'd lost fathers to different kinds of hatred, finding something like understanding in the space between their griefs. Outside, the Kansas sun blazed down on Camp Concordia. Inside, 2 people were learning that healing began with telling the truth. August 1st, 1945. The news came through on the camp's radio at 3 in the afternoon. President Truman had announced the Potsdam Declaration. Germany was to be divided into occupation zones. Prisoners of war would begin repatriation in phases starting September 1st. The war in Europe was officially, finally, completely over. The announcement sent ripples through Camp Concordia. For the German prisoners, it meant the uncertainty of return. What would they find when they got home? Who would still be alive? What country would even exist? For the American soldiers, it meant potential reassignment. The war in the Pacific was still raging. Many expected orders to ship out within weeks. The atomic bomb hadn't been dropped yet. Nobody imagined the war would end in less than 2 weeks. James Thornton found Helena in the library that evening. She was sitting at one of the reading tables, not shelving books, not working, just sitting. The photograph of her family lay in front of her. "You heard?" James asked, sitting down across from her. "Yes, I go home in September, maybe October." She didn't sound happy or sad, just tired. Home, as if that word means anything anymore. "Your mother's there." "Yes, my mother is there, in a city of ruins, working in a hospital with no medicine." Helena looked up at him. "What do I do when I go back, James? How do I live in a place that did such terrible things?" It was a question he couldn't answer. How do you rebuild a life after your entire world revealed itself as a lie? "You do what you can," James said finally. "You help where you're needed. You tell the truth when you can. You try to be better than what came before." "Like you do?" Helena asked. "You who fights for a country that does not even let you vote?" The question landed hard because it was true. James wore the uniform of the United States Army. He guarded prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. He represented American justice and American values. But in Mississippi, he couldn't register to vote, couldn't eat at most restaurants, couldn't drink from certain water fountains. "It's not the same," James said. But even as he said it, he knew it was a weak answer. "No," Helena agreed. "It is not the same. What Germany did was worse, much worse. But the principle, it is similar, yes? Your country says all men are created equal, but it does not believe this. My country said Germans were superior, also a lie." She reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact. Her palm was warm against his. "I think maybe this is why we understand each other," Helena said softly. "We both love countries that do not love us back." Sergeant Thomas Carter found them like that an hour later. James's friend stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. Two people holding hands across a library table. A black American soldier and a German prisoner of war. Carter's expression was unreadable. "Private Thornton," Carter said formally. "Captain Hayes wants to see you in his office. Now." James felt his stomach drop. He released Helena's hand and stood. "Yes, Sergeant." As he followed Carter across the compound, his friend finally spoke. "You're playing with fire, James. You know that, right?" "I know." "Captain Hayes is fair, but he's still Army. There are rules, and you're breaking them." "I haven't done anything wrong," James said, but it sounded defensive even to his own ears. "You're falling in love with a prisoner," Carter said bluntly. "In a country where a black man can be lynched for looking at a white woman the wrong way. You think the Army's going to be understanding about this?" They reached the administration building. Carter stopped him before he went inside. "I'm your friend, James, so I'm telling you this as a friend. Be careful. The war's ending. People are going home. Don't do something now that'll haunt you forever." Captain Hayes was sitting behind his desk when James entered. The officer gestured to a chair. "Private Thornton, I'm going to be direct. Multiple people have reported that you've been spending considerable time with prisoner Helena Miller. I need to know if there's anything I should be concerned about." James chose his words carefully. "Sir, I've been assigned to library duty. Miss Miller works in the library. We've had conversations while working. Nothing inappropriate has occurred." Hayes studied him for a long moment. "Private, I've commanded this camp for 18 months. I've seen a lot of things. I know how hard it is to see people suffering and not want to help. But there are rules for good, reasons." "I understand, sir. Do you?" Hayes leaned forward. "Because I don't think you do. The war's ending. These prisoners are going home. You'll likely ship out to the Pacific or get sent back to your unit. Whatever you think is happening here, it has an expiration date." He wasn't wrong. But James couldn't bring himself to care about logistics when Helena was the first person in his life who'd ever really seen him. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Hayes nodded. Every day, I watch us treat these prisoners better than my own country treats me. We feed them. We house them. We give them medical care and respect. And I'm supposed to go back to Mississippi after this and accept that I'm less than human? That's not the point, Private. With respect, sir, I think it is exactly the point. Hayes sighed. You're dismissed. But Thornton? Whatever you're doing, stop. That's an order. James saluted and left. But as he walked back across the compound, he knew he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Some things mattered more than orders. August 10th, 1945. The world changed that morning, though nobody at Camp Concordia knew it yet. 4 days earlier, an atomic bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. The day before, another had leveled Nagasaki. Japan would surrender in 5 days. The war, all of it, would finally be over. But James Thornton wasn't thinking about Japan or atomic bombs or the end of the war. He was thinking about Helena Miller and the fact that she'd be leaving soon. September at the latest. Maybe sooner now that Japan was on the verge of collapse. The army would want to process prisoners quickly, clear out the camps, move on. He'd made a decision. It was probably the craziest decision he'd ever made. Definitely the most dangerous. But he'd spent 26 years living by other people's rules, and those rules had never protected him, or his family, or anyone who looked like him. That evening, he found Helena in their usual spot, the quiet corner of the library near the history section. She was reading The Grapes of Wrath, the same book he'd been reading the day they first really talked. "Helena," he said, and she looked up, smiling at the sound of his voice. That smile still surprised him every time. The fact that she was happy to see him felt like a miracle. "James, I was hoping you would come." He sat down across from her, his heart hammering. He'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his head. Now, facing her, all his careful words evaporated. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to really think about it before you answer." Helena set the book down, her expression growing serious. "What is it?" James took a deep breath. Here, in a prisoner of war camp in Kansas, in the dying days of the bloodiest war in human history, he was about to do something that would change both their lives. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them. Helena stared at him, like he'd spoken a language she didn't understand. "What?" she whispered finally. "Marry me," James repeated. "I know it's crazy. I know there are 1,000 reasons why you should say no. But Helena, I love you. I love the way you see the world. I love your honesty. I love that you're trying to be better than what you were taught to be. And I think, maybe, you love me too." Helena's eyes filled with tears. "James, you cannot mean this." "I've never meant anything more in my life." "But I am German. You are American. I am white. You are black. In my country, this would be forbidden. In your country, this would be dangerous." "I know," James said, "but the war's ending. The old rules are breaking. Maybe it's time we made some new rules." Helena stood up abruptly, turning away from him. Her shoulders shook. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Why would you choose me? A German woman? After everything my country did? After everything I was part of?" "You weren't part of anything," James said, standing but not approaching her. "You were a kid who believed what she was taught because that's what kids do. That's not the same as being guilty." "But I believed it, James. I believed Jews were inferior. I believed Slavs were subhuman. I believed your people were... She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know what you believed. You told me. And I know you don't believe it anymore." Helena turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "How can you forgive that? How can you want to marry someone who once thought you were less than human?" James moved closer now, close enough to see the pain in her eyes. Because I believed lies, too. I believed white people would always hate me. I believed fighting back would only get me killed. I believed I deserved the treatment I got because maybe, deep down, I wasn't as good as them. He took her hands in his. We were both taught to hate, Helena. Different reasons, different targets, but the same poison. And somehow, against all odds, we're learning to love instead. That's not something I want to walk away from. But what kind of life can we have? Helena asked desperately. Where can we go? Your country will hate this. My country will hate this. Where do people like us belong? I don't know, James admitted. But I'd rather figure it out together than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Helena looked at their joined hands, at his dark skin against her pale fingers, at the physical representation of everything that should divide them. I am afraid, she whispered. So am I. I do not know if I am strong enough for this. You're the strongest person I know. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and James saw something shift in her expression. Not acceptance yet, but possibility. I need time, Helena said finally. To think, to understand what you are asking. Of course. This is not no, she added quickly, but it is not yes either. I need time. James nodded, releasing her hands. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. But even as he said it, they both knew time was the one thing they didn't have. Chapter 9. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. The announcement came through on the camp radio at 7 in the morning. The war was over. All of it. Europe, the Pacific, everything. Camp Concordia erupted in celebration. American soldiers whooped and hollered. Some fired rifles into the air until Captain Hayes shut that down. Others simply sat down and cried, overwhelmed by relief. They'd survived. After years of death and fear and uncertainty, they'd survived. The German prisoners received the news more quietly. For them, Japan's surrender meant their status would change even faster. The army would want these camps empty as quickly as possible. Repatriation would accelerate. Some prisoners might ship out within weeks. Helena Miller stood in the women's barracks, listening to the celebration outside, feeling nothing. The war was over. She should feel relief. Instead, she felt panic. Because the war ending meant time was up. She had to make a decision about James, and she still didn't know what that decision should be. For 3 days, she'd avoided him. It wasn't hard. The camp was in chaos, processing paperwork, inventory checks, preparations for mass repatriation. Nobody noticed one German prisoner staying away from the library, but she couldn't avoid the question. Did she love James Thornton enough to choose a life that would be impossibly hard? Because it would be hard. In America, their marriage would be illegal in most states. In Germany, she'd be labeled a traitor for consorting with the enemy, doubly condemned for choosing a black man. They would have no home, no community, no acceptance, just each other, against a world that would despise them for existing. On the 3rd day, Sergeant Thomas Carter found her during her work shift. The laundry was short-handed because so many prisoners were being processed for departure. Helena had been reassigned back to washing duty. Miss Miller? Carter said formally. Can I speak with you for a moment? Helena followed him outside, nervous. Had she done something wrong? Was she in trouble? Carter looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure he should be having this conversation. I'm James's friend, have been since basic training, and I need to tell you something. Helena waited. James is the best man I know, Carter said. He's kind, he's honest, he believes in doing right even when it costs him, and he's falling apart over you. I did not mean to hurt him. I know, but you are hurting him, because he asked you something important, and you're hiding instead of answering." Helena felt shame burn through her. "You think I should say no? Tell him to forget about me?" "Actually," Carter said, surprising her, "I think you should say yes." Helena stared at him. "I'm not blind," Carter continued. "I see how you look at him. I see how he looks at you. Whatever this is between you, two, it's real. And real love, the kind that crosses every line society draws, that's rare, maybe too rare to waste." "But it will be so hard," Helena whispered. "Yes, it will be hell. People will hate you both. You'll face things I can't even imagine. But you know what's harder? Spending the rest of your life wondering what if." Carter started to walk away, then stopped. "War taught me something, Miss Muller. Tomorrow isn't guaranteed. None of us know how much time we have. So when you find something worth fighting for, you fight for it, even if the odds are bad." That afternoon, Helena finally went to the library. But James wasn't there. Mrs. Chen looked up from her desk with gentle eyes. "He requested a transfer," she said quietly. "To different duty. He thought it would make things easier for you." Helena felt something break inside her chest. "Where is he?" "Motor pool, vehicle maintenance." Helena actually ran across the camp, ignoring the stares of soldiers and prisoners alike. She found James in the motor pool, his hands covered in engine grease, working on a transport truck. "James." He looked up, surprised. "Helena, what are you doing here?" "I came to give you my answer." James set down his wrench slowly. Other soldiers were watching now, but Helena didn't care. Some things were more important than discretion. "I am afraid," Helena said, her voice shaking. "I am so afraid of what this will mean. What we will face, where we will go, how we will live." James nodded, his expression carefully neutral, preparing himself for rejection. "But I am more afraid," Helena continued, "of living the rest of my life without you, of returning to Germany alone, of never knowing what we could have been." She took a step closer. "You asked me why you would choose me. But I think the better question is, why would I choose you? And the answer is because you see me. Not as German, not as enemy, not as someone who believed terrible things. You see me as I am trying to become. And that is a gift I never expected to receive." James's eyes were bright with tears. "So what are you saying?" "I am saying yes, James Thornton. I will marry you. I will choose you. I will choose this hard, impossible, beautiful thing we are trying to build." Around them, the motor pool had gone completely silent. Every soldier, black and white, was watching this moment unfold. Some looked shocked, some looked angry, but a few, just a few, looked something like hopeful. James crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. Helena held on tight, feeling his heart racing against her chest, knowing her own heart was beating just as fast. They would face hell for this, she knew that. But right now, holding James in the Kansas sunshine, Helena Miller felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt free. August 22nd, 1945. Captain Richard Hayes sat behind his desk, looking at the 2 people standing in front of him with expressions somewhere between admiration and exasperation. Private James Thornton and Helena Muller had just informed him of their intention to marry. "Sit down," Hayes said, gesturing to the chairs. "Both of you." They sat. James maintained military bearing, spine straight, eyes forward. Helena's hands were folded in her lap, but James could see her knuckles were white. Hayes pulled out a file folder. "I've spent the last hour reviewing regulations, and I have news, some good, some complicated, some that's going to make your lives very difficult." He looked at James first. "Private Thornton, there is no regulation explicitly forbidding you from marrying a former enemy prisoner of war, The key word there is former. Miss Miller's status changes the moment she's officially released from custody. He turned to Helena. Miss Muller, your repatriation orders came through this morning. You're scheduled to ship out September 15th. That gives us 3 weeks. 3 weeks for what, sir? James asked. To process the paperwork that will allow you to stay in the United States as a displaced person rather than return to Germany. To arrange a military marriage. To prepare you both for what comes next. Hayes leaned back in his chair. I'm going to help you, but I need you to understand what you're facing. He pulled out a map of the United States. Anti-miscegenation laws. That means laws prohibiting interracial marriage, currently in effect in 30 states, including Kansas, where we are right now. The Army can perform your marriage under military authority, but the moment you step into civilian life, your marriage may not be recognized depending on where you are. Hayes circled several states. You cannot live in Mississippi, James. Your home state won't recognize your marriage. Same for most of the South, most of the West, several Midwest states. Where can we go? Helena asked quietly. New York, Pennsylvania, a handful of northern states. But even there, you'll face discrimination, hostility, possibly violence. Hayes met their eyes. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm trying to prepare you. He pulled out another document. I've been in contact with the American Friends Service Committee. They're a Quaker organization that's been helping refugees and displaced persons. They've agreed to sponsor Helena's immigration and provide you both with initial housing support in Philadelphia. Why are you helping us, sir? James asked. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Because I've spent 3 years running this camp. 3 years watching Americans treat German prisoners better than America treats its own black citizens. And I'm tired of that hypocrisy. He looked at both of them directly. You two are choosing to see each other as human beings, to love across every line society draws. That takes courage I'm not sure I have. So yes, I'm going to help you. Because maybe if enough people make different choices, things actually change. Over the next week, over the sigh, reality crashed over them in waves. Helena's immigration paperwork was a nightmare of bureaucracy. The military chaplain who would perform the ceremony lectured them for an hour about the difficulties ahead. Sergeant Carter helped James navigate the discharge process he'd need to complete to leave the Army and start civilian life. But the hardest part was telling people. James wrote a letter to his mother in Mississippi. He tried to explain about Helena, about their decision, about why he wouldn't be coming home. He posted the letter knowing it might be the last communication they'd have. His mother was in her 50s, living in a state where their marriage was illegal, in a community where his choice would be seen as betrayal. Helena wrote to her mother in Munich. Her letter was shorter, starker. She was staying in America. She was marrying a black American soldier. She didn't know when or if she'd return to Germany. She hoped her mother would understand. She knew she probably wouldn't. Other prisoners found out. Some German women congratulated Helena quietly, telling her they hoped she'd be happy. Others stopped speaking to her entirely, treating her like she'd betrayed them. One woman spat at her feet and called her a race traitor. Helena wiped away the spit and kept walking. The American soldiers were divided, too. Some, mostly other black soldiers, offered James quiet support. One soldier, Private Robert Williams from Chicago, told him, "You're braver than me, man. I hope it works out." Other soldiers, mostly white, made their opinions clear through cold silence and turned backs. One afternoon, 3 white soldiers cornered James near the barracks. The leader, a private from Alabama, got right in James's face. "You think you're special, boy? Think you can cross that line and nothing will happen?" "I'm not looking for trouble," James said evenly. "Well, you found it, because there are people who won't tolerate this, who'll make sure you understand there are consequences." Sergeant Carter appeared from nowhere, positioning himself between James and the other soldiers. "That sounded like a threat, Private. You want to repeat it for Captain Hayes?" The Alabama soldier backed off, but the message was clear. This was going to follow them, maybe forever. That night, James found Helena in the library, their sanctuary, surrounded by books that would soon belong to someone else's life. "Are you sure?" he asked her. Not about love. He knew she loved him, but about everything else. The cost, the price, the life they'd have to build from nothing. Helena stood and took his hands. "I am sure. Not because it will be easy, but because you are worth fighting for. We are worth fighting for." Chapter 11. September 1st, 1945. The wedding. Military regulations required 72 hours' notice for armed forces marriages. Captain Hayes had given them exactly that, processing the paperwork with military efficiency. The ceremony would take place in the camp chapel at 10 in the morning. Small, private, just the witnesses required by law. James stood in his dress uniform, the same olive drab he'd worn for 3 years, now pressed and perfect. His hands shook as he adjusted his tie. Sergeant Thomas Carter stood beside him, acting as best man. "You ready for this?" Carter asked. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." "That's what courage is, brother. Doing it scared." The chapel was modest, a simple wooden building that served all faiths. 20 folding chairs, a small altar, windows that let in the morning light. Captain Hayes had arranged flowers, white chrysanthemums from the camp greenhouse, a small gesture of beauty in an otherwise stark place. Helena waited in the women's barracks, wearing a dress that Corporal Martha Foster had helped her acquire. Nothing fancy, just a simple blue dress from the post exchange. But Foster had pressed it carefully, added a white ribbon belt, and found white shoes that almost fit. "You look beautiful," Foster said, her eyes bright with tears. "I look terrified," Helena replied. "You look like a woman about to do something brave." Foster handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from outside the camp. "For luck." The walk to the chapel felt like walking through history. Other prisoners stopped to watch. Some smiled. Some looked away. One old German soldier, a veteran of the First World War, saluted as she passed. Helena didn't know what it meant, but it felt like respect. The chaplain was an older man, Father Thomas O'Brien, who'd served in the First World War himself. He'd seen enough of the world to know that love found in foxholes and prison camps was often the truest kind. "We gather today," Father O'Brien began, "in the sight of God and these witnesses, to join James Thornton and Helena Miller in holy matrimony." The words washed over them. Traditional vows, ancient promises. But when James took Helena's hands and spoke his vows, there was nothing traditional about it. "I promise to love you across every border, to stand with you against every storm, to choose you every day, even when that choice costs us everything." Helena's voice trembled as she replied, "I promise to be worthy of this gift you give me, to build with you a life bigger than the hate we were taught, to love you not despite our differences, but because of what those differences have taught us." Father O'Brien produced 2 simple gold bands. Carter had helped James purchase them from a jeweler in Concordia, using his saved army pay. Nothing fancy, just solid gold circles, unadorned. "These rings are symbols of eternity," Father O'Brien said, "an unbroken circle without beginning or end. May your love be equally unending." James slipped the ring onto Helena's finger. His hands steadied as he did so, as if this simple act anchored him. Helena did the same, her touch gentle. "By the authority vested in me by the United States Army and the state of Kansas, I now pronounce you husband, and wife. Father O'Brien smiled. You may kiss your bride? James cupped Helena's face in his hands and kissed her. It was their first kiss, witnessed by a handful of people in a prison camp chapel, but it felt like the whole world watched. When they separated, Helena was crying. So was James. They signed the papers. Carter and Foster signed as witnesses. Captain Hayes signed as officiating officer. And just like that, James Thornton and Helena Miller became James and Helena Thornton, husband and wife, united in a marriage that half their country wouldn't recognize. The celebration was small. Carter had arranged for cake from the camp kitchen, a simple yellow cake with white frosting. They ate it in the chapel, this tiny group of people who'd witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. To the happy couple, Carter toasted with coffee. May you prove us all wrong about how hard this will be. We won't, James said honestly. It will be exactly as hard as everyone says. But we'll survive it. That afternoon, they processed Helena's discharge papers. She was no longer a prisoner of war. She was Helena Thornton, displaced person, authorized to remain in the United States under sponsorship of the American Friends Service Committee. Her identification papers listed James as her husband. They had $300 in savings, 1 train ticket to Philadelphia, a letter of introduction to the Quaker housing office, and each other. As the sun set on their wedding day, they stood at the edge of Camp Concordia, looking at the road that led away. Tomorrow they would take that road. They would leave behind the war, the camp, the strange bubble where their love had been possible. Are you frightened? Helena asked. Terrified, James admitted. You? More than I can say. They held hands, this impossibly married couple, and watched the sun paint Kansas red and gold. They'd chosen each other. They'd married despite everything. Now they had to live with that choice. But standing there together, watching the day end and their new life begin, they both felt something that transcended fear. They felt hope, fragile, uncertain, but real. The war had taught them about hate. Now they'd learn about love. And maybe, just maybe, love would be enough. May 3rd, 1946. 8 months after their wedding. Munich, Germany. James and Helena Thornton stood in front of a building that no longer existed. At least, not as Helena remembered it. The apartment house where she'd grown up was now a hollow shell. The roof had collapsed inward. The walls were pocked with shrapnel scars. The windows were empty holes that stared like dead eyes. 3rd floor, Helena said quietly, pointing at nothing. That was our apartment. I had a small room facing the street. Carl's room was next to mine. We used to tap messages on the wall at night after our parents told us to sleep. James squeezed her hand. They'd arrived in Germany 3 days earlier, sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee Relief Program. The Quakers had given them jobs helping distribute food and medical supplies to German civilians. It wasn't much pay, but it came with housing in a relatively intact building and the chance to help rebuild a broken country. Helena's mother, Anna Miller, had been waiting at their assigned housing when they arrived. The reunion had been careful, tentative. Anna was 52, but looked 70. The war had aged her in ways that time alone couldn't explain. She'd stared at James for a long moment, this black American soldier her daughter had married. Then she'd hugged him. You kept her alive, Anna had said in halting English. That is enough. Now, standing in the rubble of her childhood, Helena tried to explain to James what Munich had been before the bombs. The cafes that served real coffee and fresh pastries. The bookshops where her father had spent Saturday afternoons. The Christmas markets that filled the squares with light and music and the smell of roasted almonds. It was beautiful once, she said, before we destroyed it all. You didn't destroy it, James corrected gently. The war destroyed it. There's a difference. They walked through the ruined city, passing block after block of devastation. Over 50% of Munich had been destroyed by bombing. 351 buildings were completely gone. Thousands more were damaged beyond repair. But amid the ruins, life persisted. Children played in the rubble. Women hung laundry on lines strung between broken walls. Old men cleared debris by hand, one brick at a time. The American Friends Service Committee relief station occupied a former school building that had somehow survived mostly intact. James and Helena worked there 6 days a week, distributing food parcels, medical supplies, and clothing to German civilians who had nothing. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. German prisoners had been fed by Americans during the war. Now German civilians were being fed by Americans after the war. The contrast with how Germany had treated others was stark and shameful, but what surprised James most was the reception they received. He'd expected hostility. A black American helping Germans should have been an easy target for whatever hatred remained. Instead, people were desperate enough to accept help from anyone who offered it. They didn't care about his skin color. They cared about the food he distributed and the medicine he provided. One afternoon, an old woman came to the station with her grandson. The boy, maybe 7 years old, was sick with pneumonia. Helena translated as the grandmother begged for medicine. "Please," she said, "I have lost everyone else. He is all I have left." James went to the medical supplies and found the penicillin. The precious antibiotics that had saved so many American lives during the war were now being used to save German children. He handed the vials to the grandmother, explaining through Helena how to administer them. The old woman looked at James with tears streaming down her face. "Why do you help us? After everything we did?" James thought about that question. It was the same question Helena had asked him in Camp Concordia, what felt like a lifetime ago. Why kindness? "Because the war is over," James said, and Helena translated. "And we either learn to help each other or we keep destroying each other. I'd rather build than destroy." That evening, James and Helena walked to the Isar River. The bridges had been bombed, but someone had built a temporary footbridge from salvaged wood. They stood in the middle, watching the water flow past, constant and unchanging, while everything around it transformed. "Do you regret it?" Helena asked. "Marrying me? Coming here?" James didn't answer immediately. The truth was complicated. Life had been exactly as hard as everyone had warned. They'd faced discrimination in Philadelphia before leaving for Germany. Some Quakers had been supportive, others had been coldly polite. They'd lived in a tiny room, worked for almost nothing, and experienced daily reminders that their marriage was seen as wrong by most of the world. But standing here, watching Helena's face in the fading light, watching her find purpose in helping her broken country heal, James knew his answer. "Not for a second," he said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." They stood there as the sun set over ruined Munich, two people who had chosen love over hate, hope over despair, building over destroying. Around them, a shattered city was slowly coming back to life. And in that resurrection they found their own. The war had taught them about the depths of human hatred. Now they were learning about the heights of human compassion. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.